Streaming? I believe so. How's it going, everybody? How is it going? Well, here. Reconnection successful. Okay, it's always a learning experience every time I start one of these up. So, um, I I had my triumphant return to streaming after my few-week hiatus. That was now like what, 6 days ago, and I somehow risked going almost a whole nother week. So even though I'm kind of tired today, I wanted to try to get a stream in before bed. Um, for those who don't know, I've had my teaching semester starting, in really just a week at this point, and I've been designing the syllabi for my courses. And it's always a pain in the butt because you have to kind of sketch out the whole semester, right? All the readings and homework and everything you're going to be doing, at least tentatively, over this semester. You need to do a whole schedule for that, but you also need to spend a lot of time designing class policies and stuff, because if you don't have things down in writing, um, it can bite you in the butt later. And then, of course, AI has, I almost want to rant about this for a minute just at the beginning of my stream here. The way AI has just so profoundly negatively impacted higher education so rapidly, especially in the arts and humanities, where, we're disciplines that are really reading and writing heavy. And even, when I was an undergrad, it's like I can't even conceive of what a philosophy class looks like without multiple essays and research papers you're working on. But we're at a point now where we almost can't even really assign these take home essays anymore, because they just end up being overwhelmingly AI. And you can have all these rules and outline in your syllabus. Well, if you use AI, that's plagiarism, and it'll be treated like you were ripping off Spark Notes or something. That's what it would have been back in the day. Would have been copying Spark Notes or something. But here's the problem. If you copy Spark Notes, that's something that I'm just playing with my mic here. If you copy Spark Notes, that's something that can be pretty conclusively proven, right? You can get caught pretty red-handed doing it. um it's just really a matter of, there's these basic checkers. Somebody submits something, it reads off to you, because 'cause let's be clear, just 1 minute, let me take a minute to say, we instructors and professors, like, we know when you haven't written your own work. Like, we know when you're copying someone else. We know when you're using AI. Why? Because it's freaking obvious. And sometimes I genuinely wonder, like, what kind of a fool do you take me for? Submitting this in my class. Like, do you really think I'm so stupid that I'm not going to be able to take one look at this and go, you didn't write this. AI generated it or something, because it's far above your writing ability. Even a good student is going to have mistakes in their writing. There's going to be ideas they don't fully grasp. Even an A paper is going to read like that, right? And so we kind of a joke now that actually the papers we really like getting are the ones that are making a good faith effort, and showing some kind of an understanding of the material, but still making mistakes along the way, the imperfect papers, because those are the ones we know the student actually sat there and wrote this themselves. But if you submit a paper and it's just like this comprehensive breakdown of all the material, and is bringing in things from sources we didn't even read, and going over these very high advanced ideas and vocabulary that there's just no way an undergraduate student should know. I mean, how stupid do you think we are? Like, we read that, we go, okay, this was not written by a 19-year-old college sophomore. It just wasn't. And that's not trying to be mean to anybody. It's just to say, if you're a college freshman, a college sophomore, a college, even an upper class, if you're an undergraduate student, especially in these, I teach a lot of these, freshman, sophomore year classes. Um, if you're if you're that kind of a student, if you're like an 18, 19, 20-year-old freshman, sophomore in college, you're by definition like not a great writer. Even if you're an A student, you just don't have a certain level of writing ability, and you're not going to understand all the material, and you're going to make mistakes, and it's going to be obvious. Um, And that's even an A paper, right? So just like, how stupid do you think we are if you of all people are then the one who's turning in an assignment that's just this like highly advanced, masterful breakdown of these sophisticated philosophical topics, digesting, and quoting from the material going far beyond what we even read in class. You obviously didn't write it, so we know every time, right? It's just here's the difference. Back in the day, back in the let's call it the Spark Notes day, when that was kind of like the main way people would try to get around writing, doing the reading and writing, if you were either copy pasting SparkNotes or even just paraphrasing, because even just paraphrasing another source without quoting it is plagiarism too. And if you were quoting or paraphrasing, um, you know, from something like SparkNotes, and we would read it and go, okay, this is obviously far beyond your ability. You obviously didn't write this. And then we look it up, and there's tools where you look it up, and you can just find the SparkNotes page that you copied from, whether directly or paraphrase, and you're caught red-handed. There's no talking your way out of that. Here's what you submitted, and here's a SparkNotes page that says the same thing. So it's pretty easy to enforce. But now with AI, it's like, don't get me wrong, as instructors, we always know when you're using AI. It's obvious. The problem is, how do you prove it? How do you really prove it? All I can do is say, I mean, doesn't this read like AI to you? I've got a gut feeling. And like 98% of the time, that gut feeling's right. But at the end of the day, you just kind of can't really prove it. And so AI has just really, really, really had such a negative impact on higher education. We're at a point where basically what I've had to do for this semester is for all essays in class, I've had to turn into in-class assignments where I had to set aside multiple writing days in the semester and just have certain amount of time in class where the students come in and work on these essays in class. Because I can't give them as take-home assignments. I tried doing this last semester with like one paper, and it was just all a bunch of AI that I can't really enforce. And I know everybody's doing it, but I can't really enforce it. So I guess I'm just venting a little bit about some of my challenges getting my courses designed for this semester before I jump into my stream, or my reaction rather. But what I wanted to do tonight was I found a fun little video. I may not have set up my window capture correctly, so I actually might have to fix that now real quick. So I'll just keep chit-chatting while I set this up. We're gonna say window capture. Um, no, that's a little weird. Okay. Remove. Try this again. Window capture. Okay. Yep, here we go. Oh, great. That well, let me fix the So then we're gonna go to transform, fit to screen. Transform, stretch to screen. Maybe I'll try that one more time. Transform. No, we want to stretch it. See, this has been a learning experience for me too, guys. Okay. Now I just need to fix, I gotta go to VTube Studio, go to setting. I honestly, guys, I should have done this before I started the stream. To be honest with you, I'm really exhausted just off of designing. My semester hasn't even started yet, and I'm already working myself ragged just designing these courses. I thankfully have, I teach at a four-year university as well as a community college. I have my four-year university courses done with, they're designed. And I just published those in the syllabi for them today. I still need to finish my community college courses, and I was making progress on that earlier. But, it's funny, I haven't even started my semester. I'm already like running myself ragged. But yeah, so I'm just kind of tired, guys, to be honest with you. I'm a little out of it. But I wanted to get this stream in. So here's what we're gonna do. I am kind of being a fool right now. I could have had this done by now, but basically I go to change background, color picker, then we're going to go, okay, allow transparency, and then we're going to go back to OBS, and I'm going to move this up. See, there I am. And now I just got to move my guy like down here or something. But why am I so small? That's normally not how that works. I mean, I could keep it that way, but I don't know. What if I like, huh? I don't know. I'm kind of not really complaining. It's just normally my avatar is bigger than this. But, yeah, it's kind of interesting, actually. See, I should have done all this before the stream started. Oh, well. You live and you learn. And you live in, okay, that was weird. You live and you learn. Alright, let's fit the screen. And you live and you learn some more. You live and you learn, you live some more, you learn some more. Okay. Well, we'll just keep it like this for now. I don't know, maybe it ends up being a better format. But basically, so this is life's biggest philosophical questions, explained in 13 minutes. Actually, you know what? I'm kind of curious now. Is there like a way I can zoom in? I'm sure there's got to be, and I'm just being really, really stupid about it. And it's kind of really frustrating, actually. Scale. Point, hide, blend, orders. This is all something I could have done before the stream started. Oh, well, you know what? You live and you learn. We're going to just roll with this for now. Okay. Life's biggest philosophical questions explained in 13 minutes by Easily Explained. So this is actually someone I'm not super familiar with. But they're doing pretty well, 82K subscribers. And they had an interesting video.
Don't just take classes, take charge.
Stupid ads and super loud.
Start your comeback today at Purdue Global.
Ladies and gentlemen.
It just... YouTube's really got to calm down with the ads. They've been really piling them on lately. Okay. So, I was kind of really interested to react to this video. Oh, wait a minute. There we go. I was kind of really interested to react to this video. Basically, you know, life's biggest philosophical question explained in 13 minutes. It's part of their Explained series. And just some of these are such a good jump-off point kind of discussions. And I also thought it's kind of helpful given that I'm still fiddling around here. But I also thought it's kind of helpful given that it might, you know, I've been experimenting with how to transform these live streams into YouTube edits. And a lot of times if I have a main video I'm reacting to, I'll just kind of have a supercut of that video. And it'll be like a 45-minute long, 50-minute long kind of video. But I've had the idea of wanting to experiment more with breaking things up into shorter form videos. So a thought I actually had, and one of the benefits I thought of a video like this, is that it might actually allow me to, you know, kind of take each of these individual philosophical questions and subjects and break them up, you know, into their own kind of little YouTube video. So I'm just still experimenting as a content creator. But anyway, let's just go ahead and dive right into this. And sorry for all the my apologies for all the technical issues and, you know, little sluggishness getting going here. Like I said, I'm just kind of out of it, but I'm excited to get a react in tonight.
Why is there something rather than nothing? Of all the questions humanity has ever asked, this might be the most profound. Why does anything exist at all? Why is there a universe, a reality, rather than absolute nothingness?
This is a classic question, and it basically gets into oops, I keep doing that. And it basically gets into something called metaphysical contingency versus necessity. So it gets into things like modal logic and modal metaphysics. So to say that something exists necessarily is to say that it has to exist. Its non existence is literally impossible. It's impossible for it not to exist. So its existence follows to a point of logical necessity. Right? To say something is metaphysically contingent is to say that that thing can possibly exist. Its existence is not impossible. It could exist, but it's not necessary either. It doesn't have to either, right? And so something can be actual and contingent. So it actually exists, but it also could have not existed. But it can also be, non-existent yet still possible, right? In both of those scenarios, you're talking about an existence that could be, but also could not be. And then you have these kind of two, and that's sort of in between these two extremes of impossible existence, something that cannot possibly exist, like a round circle or a four-sided triangle or a married bachelor. Those just cannot possibly exist. Then you have the idea of something that necessarily must exist. Um, but so what's being kind of observed here and pointed out here is that if you look at the totality of the observable universe, all of the totality of space and time and matter and energy, all of the observable universe, all of space and time and matter and energy would all appear to be metaphysically contingent, right? It would all appear to be a conglomerate of stuff that certainly can exist and in fact does, but it doesn't necessarily have to either. It could have not existed. And when we make that observation, suddenly we're left with a real issue that deals with things like causation, where if something doesn't have to exist, if it merely could only possibly exist, then it seems its existence, it doesn't explain itself. It seems we need to start appealing to some external third cause or not third, or just some external cause in order to explain its existence. We need to identify some variable or factor that accounts for why, of these two equally possible options of existence and non-existence, why did it go the existence route, right? But the idea of something that's metaphysically necessary is to say something that it has to exist by definition and therefore requires no additional explanation. It explains itself. So this is a classic question that's getting at something. It's pointing at what would the proper term would be the contingent, the metaphysically contingent nature of the observable universe. It just simply doesn't explain itself. Oh, I need to open up.
Why doesn't it all look like this? Hello? Hello? The German philosopher Gottfried
Yes,
Leibniz famously
Leibniz.
asked this very question, concluding that there must be a necessary being,
Yep.
something that
It's
exists by its
exactly what
own
we were just
nature.
talking about.
Many religious traditions take
So yeah, that was an important mention. If he hadn't brought it up, I would have brought it up myself. Leibniz, famous 17th century German philosopher. He was in the Cartesian school, along with figures like Malebranche and Spinoza. Leibniz, amongst those figures, was amongst a line of philosophers in the 17th century who immediately followed Descartes, and Descartes' significant influence in our thought to be in the Cartesian school. Um, but anyway, Leibniz, some of that very language we were just discussing, contingency versus necessity, this comes from, it doesn't exclusively originate from Leibniz. Leibniz certainly popularized that language, and indeed, he had an argument for why, therefore, you have to have a necessary being. It was some of the stuff we were just talking about, that if the totality of everything in existence is only ever contingent, then this means that you just have a bunch of contingencies dependent on each other that just bottoms out without any sort of first cause or without any sort of basis for their existence or explanation for why they exist and not exist. Um, And even if the contingent things run on infinitely, some people might go that route and say, well, it's just an infinite series of causes. It just goes back infinite, and there's no real explanation beyond that. But even that doesn't make sense, because even if you had an infinite set of contingent objects, well, now you need to account for the existence of the infinite set, right? The infinite set of contingent things is itself contingent and still can't explain itself. And so this is why Leibniz argued you have to have at least one necessary being that must exist by definition as a foundation for all these contingent beings. And again, if we note the observable universe, nothing in the observable universe, space and time and matter and energy and the particular laws of nature, none of them have to be the way they are or have to be at all. They're all contingent. And if that's the case, then this is why the direction this video is going. This is why some people start to point towards things like a divine cause, or things like, or even make this into an argument for God. In fact, Aquinas's third way is effectively a contingency argument. It's for this reason, to say that you cannot find a self-sufficient explanation for existence within the observable nature, and thus you have to appeal to a supernatural, but not supernatural in the way people use that word commonly today, as like mythological or something, but supernatural. Super is Latin for above, right? So supernatural, literally above nature, or that is metaphysical, right? Beyond the physical. And that's the route this video is going, but let's continue.
Take this as an argument for God. But not everyone agrees. Bertrand Russell dismissed it
Yep,
outright,
that's correct.
saying the universe simply is, and there's no further explanation needed, which is a quite boring and unimaginative answer if you ask me.
Yeah, me too. That's actually the proper term for that would be called brute facts. This was Bertrand Russell's view, that there are just certain brute facts of nature. And what does that mean, a brute fact? It just means a fact that is, and there is really no explanation for it. It just simply is, by the brute fact of its factuality. It just simply is, right? And that's what he would just say, is that there are just these certain brute facts of nature, and there's nothing more to it. But I agree with the narrator here. I think that's a very intellectually unsatisfying answer. And it's one that many people take issue with and don't accept. But I will point out, notice it's kind of interesting, Bertrand Russell has to go that sort of weird route in order to, I just noticed the meme, that's funny, my job here is done, but you didn't do anything. Yeah, exactly. Just, well, they're just brute facts. They don't require explanations. I mean, okay, but it's interesting Russell has to go that route, and this is why, there can be in philosophy, there are a lot of people who study philosophy who end up converting, to some form of theism, because when you really study physics and metaphysics, and especially metaphysics, and get to the underlying basis of reality, there can be some very, very intellectually compelling justifications for accepting some kind of a classical theistic worldview, but maybe a topic for another video.
Modern physics, however, offers other possibilities. The Big Bang Theory suggests our universe had a beginning, but what came before it? Some physicists argue that quantum mechanics allows for something to emerge from nothing, an unstable vacuum state that inevitably produces existence.
But that actually does not answer the question, though. That doesn't answer the question, because then again, if you're just appealing now to this, okay, unstable vacuum state that can produce, okay, but then why was there an unstable vacuum state capable of producing existence rather than no unstable vacuum state capable of producing existence at all? Why was there anything, any component to reality whatsoever? You're just kind of delaying the ultimate question. This happens a lot in science, where, you know, people struggle to explain things, and then they come up with these natural and physical explanations that kind of further dissect the exact mechanistic physical phenomena going on, and they kind of provide a further, more, a more detailed description of exactly all the natural processes unfolding. But at no point are we actually approaching the metaphysical question, which again is the fundamentally contingent nature of existence, or observable that is natural observable existence in the physical world. Why was there an unstable vacuum state with this certain property that you would seem to be at that point assigning a certain property, this property of being capable of leading to existence? But that property is a something. right? It's not really a proper nothing at that point if it's a nothingness with a property capable of leading to something. So if you're going to assign this property to the nothingness, it's no longer a nothingness and instead becomes a something on some level that is also contingent in its nature. Because why have this property of being an unstable vacuum state capable of leading to existence rather than no property at all? So it doesn't really answer the question. It's because I don't think it's a question that can be answered scientifically. I think it's a question that warrants more of a philosophical inquiry.
Others propose that our universe is just one of many in an infinite multiverse,
Oh,
removing the need for a singular
God.
cause. Still, these explanations only push the question further. Why do these laws of
Yes, that's
physics
exactly right.
exist in the first
No, that's exactly right. Thank you for getting to that. Why are these laws? And also, I just wanted to make a quick point on this. I call it the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse. And by that, it's kind of a joking name. I don't literally mean like the Marvel Cinematic Universe or whatever. I mean, these kinds of multiverse theories are very, very popular right now in pop culture, and we see them in our culture and our fiction and our media all the time nowadays, like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, for example. But it's interesting because actually, in a lot of actual scholarship, even in the hard sciences, in like physics, for example, a lot of this multiverse theory stuff is a bit in string theory and M theory. It's considered a bit dated now, and it's under some increasing heavy criticism. It's nowhere near as it's it's nowhere near as accepted as it used to be. Or well, maybe a better way to put it is a lot more controversial of a theory than it used to be. And so it's interesting in the scholarship, the whole Marvel Cinematic Multiverse stuff has been sort of on the decline, but yet at the same time, it's more popular than ever in our pop culture. I have major issues with it though because again, we have this same issue here of just delaying the ultimate question, of just pushing the ultimate question back a step. Let's suppose that the observable universe around us is just one of an infinite series of universes. This still begs the question, why is there an infinite multiverse rather than nothing at all? The multiverse itself is contingent, back to that contingency versus necessity thing. There's nothing about an infinite multiverse that has to exist. Why is there any infinite multiverse at all? Even if you've now explained why this one observable universe around us exists, oh, because it's just a part of this bigger infinite multiverse. You haven't explained. So then why is there this big, infinitely more complex layer of existence behind it? The multiverse would be contingent, and it just simply does not answer the ultimate question at hand. So that's my issue with it, and that's why I call it the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse theory stuff, to kind of mock it a little bit.
first place? Why not nothing? Perhaps, as Martin Heidegger
Exactly.
suggested, this is
Ooh, I
simply
love
the
Heidegger.
fundamental question of existence, one we may never truly answer. But one thing is clear.
My thesis advisor, sorry, I'm drinking a little water. Um, my thesis advisor was did his dissertation on Heidegger. I'm a pretty big Heideggerian, and he always likes to describe Heidegger as a monomaniac about being. Heidegger was in the phenomenological tradition after figures like Husserl, but he didn't like Husserl's epoche. That is like just kind of putting the existential question aside and just saying we're not going to really engage in questions of what the ontological status is of intentional objects. We're just going to analyze our subjective, intentional relation to them. But Heidegger was much more fascinated with wanting to bring phenomenology and more broadly philosophy back to this fundamental question of being. And everything comes back to this fundamental question of being, the most fundamental question of being. There's a long history of that in philosophy, going back to the ancient Greeks, going back to pre-Socratics even. What is the arche, the first principle of reality? That was what all the pre-Socratics were constantly obsessed with. I think Heidegger's philosophical instincts were right on point with that one, and I agree with Heidegger on that. And yeah, and that's what sometimes some of this scientism stuff, it kind of just conveniently brushes some of these ultimate questions of being aside to just give us these descriptions of how natural phenomena unfold, but without really engaging with the fundamental question of something like this. Why is there something rather than nothing?
There is something rather than nothing.
Yep.
So now that you are here, you might as well get the best out of it.
This is your brain when
Okay.
you're struggling to focus.
Stupid ads. On my personal account, my personal YouTube account, I actually have I pay whatever the little monthly subscription is for premium, so I don't have to deal with the ads regularly. So every time I get on my actual YouTube channel and watch these videos, the ads always catch me off guard, and I forget just how bad YouTube is with the ads these days. um, let's continue.
God exist? If
Does God exist? That's another big one.
there is something rather than nothing, does that imply a creator? For centuries,
It could. We were talking about this earlier. You know, if um thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas would make this exact argument that if all of observable reality is only contingent, and kind of what that Leibniz argument about how there must exist therefore some necessary being. And then, there's arguments as to what would a necessary being have to look like? And Aquinas goes the route of saying it would be the essence of being itself, which would ultimately be God. That would be the divine essence. And there's various arguments and debates. You might ask, like, why does this have to therefore be like an intentional mind? Um, but there's really interesting arguments, and things like law of proportionate causality and things as to why even mental properties are arguably more fundamental. It's, again, maybe a topic for another video, but this is exactly what we were talking a little bit about earlier.
this question has fueled debate between philosophers, theologians, and scientists alike.
Yep.
The cosmological argument, famously put forth by Aquinas, asserts that everything in existence must have a cause.
Okay. It's a little reductive. So a cosmological argument isn't like one argument. It's actually a collection of arguments. It's a type of argument. A cosmological argument is generally a type of argument that tries to reason from the cosmos, from the existence of nature, to the existence of God. And this can take many different forms. Aquinas does have an argument from causation. It's his second way. He has his famous 5 ways. They're called 5 ways to God. There are these 5 arguments he puts out in Summa Theologia. But, and that's the second way, is his argument from efficient causation, which is kind of, a little more in line with this modern way of thinking about causation of like a line of dominoes falling. But that's not even really what probably Aquinas is most well known for. He's probably more well known for his first way, which is more of an Aristotelian argument that has to deal with motion and change, and the fact that the fact that change occurs implies there must be an infinite source of immutable or unchanging actuality in order to bring all other things into motion. But this couldn't be logically possible unless the first prime mover were itself unmovable or without motion. Motion means change. Today, we often use a word like motion interchangeably with like locomotion, moving, which would be change between locations, as the name implies. But that's just one kind of motion. Motion really just means all forms of change, including like becoming and perishing and whatnot. But basically, Aquinas also has his own contingency argument. We were talking about that with Leibniz. Aquinas' third way is a contingency argument. So I feel like this explanation is a little reductive. Like, you can just reduce Aquinas down to like some what's the first cause of everything. It's far more sophisticated than that. And again, I don't think you can call Aquinas' second way the cosmological argument, when a cosmological argument is really just a type of argument. But anyway, let's continue.
Trace those causes back far enough, and there must be an uncaused first cause, something that exists by necessity rather than contingency.
Again, this is actually mixing up different arguments, right? So this is kind of mixing up Aquinas' second and third ways. It's taking his argument from efficient causation and sort of conflating it with his argument from necessity and contingency. I highly recommend anybody look up the 5 ways. It's actually not, none of them are particularly lengthy. They're actually relatively concise arguments. But I'd recommend looking them up to really engage with, this influential ways of reasoning about natural theology. Natural theology is theology. So generally, theology is broken up into natural theology and revealed theology. Revealed theology would refer to theological truths that are revealed in some way. So this means this is presupposing you believe in some form of scripture, like the Bible, as containing theological truth that's been revealed intentionally to human beings. Natural theology is a study of theological truth as it's contained within nature, right? So it's the idea that you don't have to read the Bible or ever be exposed to scripture in order to know certain theological truths like God exists or God is infinitely good or whatever, because these things can be reasoned to from the observable natural world. And Aquinas is hugely influential on this idea of natural theology. I just recommend people look it up, give it a read. Aquinas' Five Ways. There's a contemporary philosopher named Ed Fraser who has a great book, Five Proofs for God, and who I think makes this stuff a lot more approachable. But just some recommended reading for my viewers.
Often identified as God. The teleological argument, or the watchmaker analogy, suggests that the
So this is Aquinas' fifth way. Aquinas has his own teleological argument, but it's far more sophisticated than a simple watchmaker argument. And again, I think we're going to see some things being conflated and oversimplified here, because Aquinas' fifth way more has to do with the directedness of objects in nature and the fact that objects even have a nature. Nature in an Aristotelian sense. Aristotle defines nature as an internal principle of motion. So remember, motion is change. So there are changes that can be inflicted upon something from an external source, right? Like if I light a piece of paper on fire and the paper combusts, its combustion into ash, that was a change that was sort of inflicted upon it from the outside, right? From forces outside of it. But in nature is a change that occurs from within. So something like, say, an acorn growing into a tree. The acorn growing into the tree, that change that occurred, where the acorn unfolded and grew into a whole tree, that wasn't inflicted upon it by outside sources. That was a source of change that came from within it, right? And so Aquinas' fifth way has to do with that. The fact that things have a natural motion, that they move towards things by their own nature. And he attempts to reason to God's existence from that. That's really the OG teleological argument, right? And the idea is the teleology kind of, I'm bringing in some modern terms here, but that it sort of correlates to intentionality, to the way the mind works. The mind points towards things, or the mind thoughts are about things, right? So the mind points in a certain direction. And there is a strong kind of relationship between the way the mind works in that way. The mind has a directedness about it, and the fact that natural objects have a directedness about them. Um, so again, teleological argument's actually much more sophisticated than this. Where this language is coming from is more modern. It's from like the 19th century. I'm trying to blank on the guy's name, but he famously beefed with Charles Darwin. But he kind of proposed this. He called it teleological argument, but it was this idea of a watchmaker. Like if you found a sophisticated, high-end watch, wristwatch on the beach, if you just stumbled across it and you held it up and looked at it, you would just kind of intuitively know it was designed by a watchmaker, just because of how intricate it is and how moving towards it's all these many parts organized together and ordered, moving towards a certain end, performing a certain function. And likewise, he tries to reason that therefore you can look to nature and see how nature is so precisely ordered, and reason towards it must be designed as well, right? So that's a more modern way of going about things like this. But I just think it's a bit erroneous to conflate the teleological argument with that alone, when in fact it has a much longer history and is a bit much more metaphysically sophisticated than that. But I've kind of gone on enough of a tangent here. Let's continue.
universe's complexity and order hint at intelligent design. Even modern physics, with its precise fundamental constants, has led some scientists to believe the universe is fine-tuned for life, suggesting a creator. But skeptics
That
argue
is
that
true.
science provides natural explanations.
That is true.
Evolution explains the diversity of life.
That is true. It is very interesting history behind it. I keep drawing blanks on important names. It's one of those tip of your tongue things, but there's a famous scientist who converted well, I don't even know if he converted to a specific religion, but he at least came to believe in God, just purely based off of his research into physics. And it is kind of remarkable just how precisely fine-tuned the universe is in a way that allows for life to be hospitable, or in a way that makes it hospitable to life being developed. There's just so many so many variables in the laws of nature that if they were just a little bit different or a little bit off, you couldn't have stars and planets and all the things needed to give rise to life, let alone intelligent life. It is pretty remarkable, and that's again, this is getting more in a modern version of what people call a teleological argument. But again, I just want to highlight that's a more modern argument. That is not really what a teleological argument is traditionally if we go back to a thinker like Aquinas. But let's continue.
Without divine intervention.
Sorry to interrupt,
Oh
but this is
God, another
important.
ad.
The shooter who
YouTube's gotta get its act together with all these ads.
Problem of evil challenges the notion of an all-powerful, all-good God.
Mm-hmm.
If he is good and sentient, why allow suffering?
Well,
Some argue that belief in God is a product of human
I'll
psychology,
let him finish
a
first.
way to find meaning in a chaotic world. The debate continues.
All right, no, he's okay. So yeah, that's the problem of evil, or really the problem of suffering. If God is infinitely powerful, infinitely knowledgeable, and infinitely good, then why does there exist all this suffering and pain and things we tend to define as bad? Is he just simply unaware that there's all this pain and suffering going on? Well, then he's not all knowing. Is it he's aware there's all this suffering going on, but he's just not able to stop it? Well, then he's not all powerful. Is it that he's aware there's all this suffering going on and he's fully capable of stopping it, but he just chooses not to? Well, then he must not be all good. That's a classic problem of evil. The problem with that argument is it's kind of presupposing an additional hidden fourth premise along the lines of, and there is no morally justifiable reason for allowing a certain amount of pain and suffering to exist. So in other words, the idea is, and there are things called theodicies. Theodicies are attempts at giving an explanation as to why it may be ultimately good for an all good, all powerful God to allow some amount of pain and suffering to exist. So this would include things like free will is a common argument. The idea is, if you could live in Orwell's 1984, if you could live in this society where everything and every aspect of your life is strictly controlled, but as a result of that, there were no crime, there was no drunk driving and drunk driving related accidents, there was no drug use and people overdosing, there was no violent crime and people victims of crime. I mean, if you think about it, the world of Orwell's 1984, as dystopic as we think of it, it is a world with effectively like zero crime rate and zero drug addiction and there's all these social ills that a world like that completely gets rid of. But it's at the cost of having every aspect of your life tightly controlled by the government. And so would you rather live in that world? Or would you rather live in a world where you have freedom, but as a consequence of that freedom, that means you have the freedom to choose to do stupid and bad things, including drugs and drunk driving and all these things that can get you killed or get someone else killed or hurt? Which would you prefer? And most people overwhelmingly would choose the second option, right? They'd say, I'd rather suffer some of the social ills and pain and suffering that comes with being free, but still be free to make those choices, than have no freedom, to then get rid of all those social ills, but at the cost of no freedom, right? So that's just meant as an example to show how there can be a reason why allowing a certain amount of pain and suffering can sometimes be the better option, right? That there's something that makes it more of a good world to live in by having a certain amount of pain and suffering. There's also, there's other theodicies. It's not just free will, because free will doesn't really explain, but well, then why do people get horrible diseases? Why do kids die of cancer and, natural disasters happen? But there's other arguments, that there are certain goods and virtues that can only be cultivated in the face of adversity and pain and suffering. So, for example, the virtue of courage can only occur when you're facing fear and danger, right? The virtue of things like being merciful and kind, like some of the aspects of mercy can only occur when you've first been wronged, right? That there are goods that arise from first suffering some amount of pain and suffering. So that there's different theodicies, different explanations for this, but there's lots of different ways in which There's lots of different ways in arguments made as to why it could be the case that you could have an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God who also simultaneously has some legitimately good reason for allowing a certain amount of pain and suffering to exist. So that's kind of the problem with the this problem of evil or problem of suffering argument. That would be the main response to it. But let's continue.
Use. Science hasn't proven God's existence, but it hasn't disproven it either. Personally, I'm agnostic. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's debatable whether that's a question science could ever prove. I mean, it's arguably not really a scientific question because science investigates natural phenomena of physical objects in the observable world, but God would necessarily be supernatural, or that is literally above nature, and therefore not something that's investigated in that same manner. I would actually recommend my video on what is God. I talk about some of this. It might be helpful.
And I don't think anyone does or ever will. Some see God as
Well, okay, that's another problem is with the whole agnostic thing. I'm sorry to keep pausing a lot. I just feel like this guy's kind of tripping up on some terminology here. Agnostic would mean kind of what he said, right? You just don't know, right? That's your position. I just don't know whether God exists or does not exist. And you can be agnostic towards any belief. You know, I don't know whether it's true the sky is blue or whether it's false the sky is blue. Um, but he's saying, I don't think anyone ever knows or ever could know. Well, that's a different position. That's more of a position of skepticism, right? Because knowledge is justified true belief. So if it happened to be the case that God existed and somebody believed it was true that God existed and they had some kind of good reason for believing it, various arguments, some of which you talked about earlier, they would have knowledge that God existed. Or if it's the case that God didn't exist and somebody believed it's true that God does not exist and they had various reasons, rational accounts as to why they are atheist like that, they would have knowledge that God does not exist. You don't need to have absolute certainty to have knowledge. And I noticed a lot of times when people say things like this, like, well, I'm an agnostic, but then they'll take that a step further to some form of radical skepticism and saying that means I don't think anybody knows whether God exists. I think they're conflating knowledge with absolute certainty. You don't have to be certain of something to have knowledge of it. It just needs to be the case that belief you have knowledge of is true and you have justification for it. You have some good reason for believing it. And as long as that's the case, so it's really just a question of does God exist or not? Because if he does, then yes, I suppose there are some people who just believe God exists without any real reason other than that's how I was raised. They, I guess, wouldn't have knowledge. But as long as you have some kind of good reasoning behind why you believe God exists, if it's true, then you have knowledge God exists. And the same applies the opposite direction. If you don't believe God exists and you have some kind of good reasoning behind believing that, as long as it's the case that God does not exist, you have knowledge that God does not exist. Again, a lot of people kind of conflate knowledge with absolute certainty, and I think that's what this guy's doing a little bit here.
is the answer to existence. Others see no need for one. In the end, it might be a question we're simply not meant to answer. Are we alone in the universe?
Well, if God existed, I think that is a question that's meant to be answered. I think that God would want human beings to use their reason to reason to a relationship with him. So I don't know if I agree with that last statement. Or if God doesn't exist, that would be a hugely important belief, I think, for human beings to know. So I don't think I agree that it's a belief we're not meant to answer. Now we're moving on to, do aliens exist? This is another. I'm really liking this video, guys. I don't know. I guess sometimes I have a knack for picking these reactions here. Oops, I accidentally closed something. Okay, just checking my chat. I do say I have a couple viewers. Welcome everybody. We're moving on to, we did why does something exist rather than nothing, and we did does God exist? This is just a fun little video on life's biggest philosophical questions. Why does something exist rather than nothing, and does God exist? Now we're moving on to, are we alone, or in other words, do aliens exist? Fun topic.
The vastness of the universe suggests that life should be abundant. So why haven't we found any? Physicist Enrico Fermi famously posed the question, where is everybody?
Yeah.
His observation, now known as Fermi's paradox, points out that if intelligent life is common, we should have seen some evidence by now. Signals, spacecraft, megastructures, something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Instead,
Fermi's paradox. It's a very famous question. It's kind of interesting. Is what does it say then that we have not seen anything? One possible answer that's speculated sometimes is that Fermi's equation is missing an important variable, which is the lifespan of intelligent life. So it's sometimes put forth that if you look at the whole grand cosmological scale, all 14 billion years or so of the universe's existence on such a grand scale, the actual amount of time that an intelligent species exists before they inevitably go extinct and or wipe themselves out is so relatively short that even though you might have intelligent life separately evolving in various different many places around the universe, it's just very unlikely that two of them happen to exist at the same time or exist within relatively close proximity to each other at the same time. And it's kind of a very cynical, pessimistic answer to the question that, maybe intelligent species just tend to wipe themselves out or go extinct far too quickly for them to ever overlap at the same time.
the universe remains eerily silent. One way to estimate the number of extraterrestrial civilizations is through Drake's equation, a formula developed by astrophysicist Frank Drake. It factors in things like the number of habitable planets, the probability of life developing, and how long civilizations might survive.
Yeah.
The math suggests that intelligent life should be common. But where is it? One possibility: we may be alone. Intelligent life could be extremely rare. Another,
That's another possible answer. Is that, I mean, how do you even calculate something like that? Right? It just could simply be that intelligent life is so rare that, I mean, or maybe there is like one or two other intelligent species, but they're just so many galaxies away. We're never going to have interaction with them.
civilizations self-destruct before reaching
Yep.
interstellar travel.
See, what did I just tell you guys? That is a common answer, right? That is a common answer. And even if they reach interstellar travel, it's like still their civilizational lifespan is so relatively short. It's, there's never any observable remnants of their civilization left over for another intelligent species to evolve and come to encounter.
Or they could be actively avoiding us.
That's
Some
true.
believe that
That's another one.
civilizations exist, but choose to stay quiet out of fear. This idea, known as the dark forest theory,
That's
suggests
another one.
that shouting into the void is dangerous. Because if intelligent species compete for survival, it might be best to remain hidden.
Yeah, the dark forest theory essentially is if you were in a dark forest surrounded, like there's a good image with like eyes of predators all around you, what would be your impulse? Right? Your instinct would be to shut up and stay quiet and hidden. Because if you make too much noise, the predators are going to swarm. And it's a very real concern that if there is intelligent life out there, there are a lot of thinkers, I think Stephen Hawking was of this position, that we should not be trying to make contact, because if there are intelligent species out there, they're by far and away most likely to be hostile upon encountering them. An important lesson to remember: back in the 1930s, the most technologically advanced civilization on planet Earth was Germany. I don't want to say the name of the certain right-wing populist nationalist political party in power at the time, because that might trigger some term of service thing with YouTube or Twitch. But basically, Germany was the most technologically advanced civilization in the 1930s. And what happened? That technological advancement was essentially used to give them an edge in aggressing upon others. It's sort of human beings, our intelligence developed as predators, right? Predatory mammals are the most intelligent species on planet Earth. Intelligence is really at its core, it's a survival tool, and it's a tool specifically that of a predator. And so if we encountered intelligent alien species, it's probably more likely than not that their first instinct would just be, oh, look, resources. Here's an Earth-like planet with a lot of resources, and the civilization on it, they're intelligent, but they're far behind us, so we can just steamroll them, right? Just like technologically advanced Europeans steamrolled and colonized, less developed parts of the world in the 18th, 19th centuries, etc. So this is the dark force theory: is that every intelligent alien species comes to realize, much like if you were surrounded by predators in a dark forest, the best move right now is just stay quiet and don't advertise your presence, or you'll end up assimilated into the Borg. All right, let's continue.
If the dark forest theory is true, it is a bit awkward for us.
Yeah, irotonic. I just saw your comment. Yeah, they would or actually, you know what? I will disagree with you a little bit, irotonic, because hate sort of implies that they would have this active care and concern for who we are, but in a way that's filled with animosity. I don't think they would even hate us so much as they'd just be completely, we would just be irrelevant to them, right? They would just be apathetic. They would just have no concern for us. Like, do you I don't know if you're like vegetarian or not, but if you eat beef, it's like, do you hate cows? Is that why you eat beef? Because you actively hate cows? No, you just don't have as much of a concern for cows because they're not intelligent creatures like human beings. They're not as advanced as human beings. So I don't even know if they'd necessarily hate us. I I just think they'd be, they just wouldn't pay us any mind as they steamroll over us to further their own interests. That's a very real concern with extraterrestrial life.
Oops. But if that theory is wrong, then why the silence? Are we the first? Are we the last? Or are we simply not listening properly? I don't know which is more terrifying.
By the way, that's another one, quick one I'll add on here, is that's another thing, is it could just be, if you've ever seen Star Trek, aliens are often depicted as being basically human beings, but with like different little bumps on their face and different colored skin. But, we think of aliens as being human-like in a way, but it just could be the case that alien life is just so radically alien that they just don't even communicate in any way we would even think to look for. It could be that they communicate by like emitting, different like smokes from their body, or they communicate it could just be they have communication that is just looks nothing like spoken or written word to human beings, right? And they're just so alien that there's just no discernible way of communicating with them. That's another obstacle.
The idea that we are truly alone, or that other intelligent beings exist, ones that might see us in the same way as we once saw lesser developed civilizations here on Earth. If history is
Yeah.
any guide,
Yep.
first contact doesn't always end well.
That's what I was just saying. Ah, stupid ads. That's what I was just saying. That's what I was just saying. Um, first contact didn't go well for Native Americans, for example.
What is consciousness? Consciousness is the core.
I'm really excited to get in this one. So we got through why is there something rather than nothing? Does God exist? And do aliens exist? It's interesting because some of these aren't necessarily like scholarly philosophical questions. They're just the kind of big questions people ask themselves, but it's just perfect material to react to from a philosophical perspective. But now we're getting into what is consciousness. Philosophy of mind, philosophical anthropology. I will say a little bit of an area of competence of mine, an area of interest of mine. I have some background in. I have a video on YouTube called What Am I? Right? It's on philosophical anthropology and philosophy of the mind, or some of the basic stuff about it. Highly recommend the video. But I'm really interested to see where we go with this segment.
Core of human experience, the awareness of self, thoughts, and sensations. Yet, science and philosophy still struggle to define what it truly is. Philosopher David Chalmers differentiates between the easy problems, explaining how the brain processes information, and the hard problem. Why does brain activity create subjective experience?
Exactly. And that's the first of the three big issues. So there's what's famously called the hard problem of consciousness, which is how do you go from objective third person perspective matter or stuff to subjective first person experience. A lot of people, it's very common in the West today to think in materialistic terms. The mind is just your physical brain. But there are so many issues with that and so many things that this kind of materialistic thinking just can't really account for. I mean, just think about it. Is your mind just simply the brain? Then what happens? Is it just if you just add enough physical parts together, you suddenly get like a subject with an I and an ego? At what point does that occur? And how does it occur? Because there doesn't seem to be anything within the physical properties of physical objects that give rise to subjective mental properties, right? This is the hard problem of consciousness. Traditionally, there are three primary issues that are serious, that a materialist has serious problems accounting for from a materialistic perspective. Materialistic perspective, again, just being like the mind is just the physical brain. Qualia, intentionality, and rationality. What he just described is the first of those, qualia. Qualia refers to the subjective, first-person, qualitative experience of um, consciousness. As an example, consider pain, right? The experience of pain. You could plug someone into an MRI, you could look at their nerves, their nervous system in their brain as they experience pain, and you could see these are the neurons firing in their arm when you cut their arm, and this is how those neurons travel up their arm and into their brain, and this is how their brain neurons fire, and here's all the physical processes going on. But nowhere in those neurons, or an MRI view of those neurons, could you ever see the actual subjective experience of what that pain feels like for them. You can't look at an MRI and go, oh, there's the subjective nature of their experience. And it's interesting because it's kind of hard to just write that off as like illusory or non-existent, because I mean, consider things like what pain subjectively feels like is something that actually has like evidential and diagnostic relevance in medicine. If you've ever been to a doctor and you say, oh yeah, I have a pain in this part of my body, and the doctor will ask you, is it a burning pain, is it a shooting pain, is it a throbbing pain? There's these different subjective experiences of that pain that can even have diagnostic relevance, right? Depending what subjective type of pain you feel it as can actually dictate what may be wrong with you medically, right? So that's qualia. And this is, again, this is the hard problem of consciousness. How do you just get from physical neurons firing to subjective first-person qualitative experiences? It's a serious problem for the materialistic view.
Why does it feel like something to be conscious? Most scientists take a materialist view,
Yep.
arguing
That's what I
that
was just saying.
consciousness emerges from neural interactions.
Yep.
Some believe it's just advanced information processing, while others see it as an illusion.
That's called epiphenomenalism, by the way. Epiphenomenalism is the idea that all of these subjective, it's going to take the materialistic view, right? But it's going to go a little step further and say that all these subjective first-person experiences are really just this illusory trick of your brain. It's just sort of this, it's just almost like side effect of your brain functioning at the level it is. And so I forget, I keep drawing blank on important people's names, but the guy who really popularized this view, he used the analogy of a train and a whistle, and the train's whistle. And the train moves down the track in this predetermined way, right? It's just a bunch of mechanical stuff, matter in motion, moving down a predetermined path. There's no like agency about it. And yet you have this whistle hollering out into the night as the train moves, seeming to give the train the appearance of some kind of a like communication it's engaging in, or some kind of a mental experience or an awareness about itself, even at the same time that it's just matter in motion moving down a track. That whistle blowing, that's what he likens consciousness to, just some quirk, some side effect of the physical processes of your brain. But like I said, that there are serious problems with that. How are we getting from objective third-person perspective stuff to subjective first-person perspective mental experience?
Neuroscience ties consciousness to activity in the cerebral cortex and thalamus. Brain Scans has identified brain activity associated with awareness, suggesting that consciousness only happens in the brain. However, not everyone agrees. In contrast,
I'm not convinced consciousness happens anywhere in any kind of location, because the location presupposes that materialistic view, and I'm not convinced that consciousness is a material process for some of the reasons we've discussed. If he doesn't get to the other two things I mentioned, I said qualia, intentionality, and rationality. Those are the big three. We've been discussing qualia so far. If he doesn't get to it, I'm gonna give him a chance to get to those other two, but if he doesn't, I'm gonna explain it a bit.
dualists following Descartes suggest that
Yeah.
consciousness exists separately from the
Yeah.
physical body.
That's classic Cartesian dualism. I really recommend my video, What Am I?, if you want to learn more about some of this stuff.
A view shared by many religious traditions that link it to the soul. Some
Hmm.
theories go even further. Panpsychism suggests that consciousness is a universal property of matter, while quantum theories, like those of Roger Penrose, propose that consciousness arises from quantum processes in neurons. If
Mm.
materialists are right and consciousness arises purely from physical processes, could artificial intelligence ever become truly conscious?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're gonna be a strict materialist, you kind of would seem you have to take the position that AI then, could be conscious. Just give if all it is just some quirky side effect of physical processes in the brain, then theoretically you should be able to physically reconstruct a brain, like particle by particle. And if you made an identical copy of someone's brain, you should have then an identical mind of them. But that's what's interesting is it seems to me I think if you really were able to reconstruct somebody's brain, like down to the atom, I don't think you would necessarily just spontaneously get a conscious experience arising out of it.
Some argue it can only mimic awareness, while others believe a sufficiently advanced AI might develop subjective experience.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I'm in that view he said where it can only mimic experience. Um, One of the first streams I ever did, I was reacting to some stuff from the Amazing Digital Circus, but we talked about the Chinese room thought experiment, which asked someone to consider if you had an English speaker locked in a room with a bunch of stacks of binders of instructions on how to respond to input. So this English speaker doesn't speak Mandarin, but you had a bunch of Mandarin speakers come up to the room and pass notes written in Mandarin through the door, not knowing who's on the other side, to the English speaker. The English speaker has stacks of binders in his room with instructions explaining to him if you receive these symbols, then respond with these symbols. So he follows these instructions every time he gets a note written in Mandarin to calculate a response and then spits a response back out. And over time these instructions get more sophisticated. The English speaker gets really really good at following the instructions, and eventually it gets to the point where your average Mandarin speaker can approach the Chinese room, pass a note in Mandarin underneath the door, get a note back, read it, and it feels subjectively to the Mandarin speaker like they're having a personable conversation with a fellow Mandarin speaker who's understanding what they're saying and responding like another, conscious agent. But interestingly, in reality, the English speaker still does not actually speak or understand a word of Mandarin. The English speaker has no idea what's actually being said. There's no meaning he's ascribing to these symbols. He's just following instructions, computing responses based on these predetermined instructions. But he's not actually understanding or thinking about the responses he's given. He has no idea what's going on. Yet the Mandarin speaker is over there feeling like, oh, I'm having this lively conversation with a fellow Mandarin speaker. So that's meant to be an analogy. The English speaker following the instructions, it's meant to be an analogy for AI, right? It's just following instructions and spitting out responses based on this predetermined code, but it's not actually understanding or ascribing meaning to or thinking about those instructions. And I think it's particularly relevant thought experiment today with things like ChatGPT and AI chatbots and stuff like that, and AI girlfriends people get, where it really feels for the human being based on the responses they're getting, like they're having this really like this mutually enjoyed conversation with another person who's really hearing what they're saying and understanding it and responding. But in reality, none of that's going on. So I tend to be more in the category of saying I think that's all AI could ever do is imitate the appearance of consciousness without ever actually being conscious. If you've ever seen Star Trek, there's Data, right? The android. An android like Data, I think, would just simply be the perfect imitation. It would be AI that's gotten so sophisticated that it appears effectively perfectly like another fellow conscious agent. Yet in reality, I don't think there's any mind, any mental experience, anything going on between Data's ears. Right? That's the direction I tend to lean in on this. And I just think it's important to distinguish between, the appearance of conscious, between exhibiting certain behaviors that we normally commonly associate with consciousness and having actual conscious mental experiences. There's a very, very important distinction there.
If robots can gain awareness, does that mean that we are just biological machines? Or is awareness something deeper, perhaps even fundamental to existence itself?
Imagine being able.
Oh my god, the ads are just so bad with this video. They're normally not this bad. I don't know what the problem is. Okay, so now we're moving on to free will, another really fascinating topic. I'm really liking this video. What are we about? Little over we're almost exactly halfway through. No, a little over halfway through.
Have free will. The question of free will, whether we truly make choices or merely follow predetermined paths, has been a philosophical battleground for centuries. Some argue that we are the architects of our own actions, while others claim our sense of control is just an illusion.
Right. And by the way, and one thing that's important to understand is that this free will issue is directly connected to the consciousness philosophy of mind issue we were just talking about. If you're going to go the materialistic route that we talked about, of basically just saying the mind is nothing but the physical brain and we're just organic machines, matter in motion, essentially, you kind of necessarily have to go a deterministic route. Because if all you are just physical processes in your brain and body. Those physical processes are being causally affected and determined by outside sources. You're receiving sensory input, and your neurons are reacting in response to external stimuli and sensory input. And then, however sophisticated or complicated series of neurons that are going on, ultimately, what you then end up choosing to do and how you act and behave and react is ultimately all the causal sequence of everything that leads to your actions is always originating from outside of yourself, right? You're ultimately nothing but a highly complicated set of dominoes falling in a line. You kind of have to end up going that deterministic route if you're going to be a materialist. And there are serious implications to going that route. For example, things like morality effectively cannot exist at that point if you don't have free will. Because as Immanuel Kant famously said, ought implies can. To be able to say that somebody should do something or should not do something, to assign moral praise, to praise someone for doing the right thing, or moral blame, to blame someone for doing the wrong thing, this necessarily presupposes that you have the choice to do otherwise. If somebody is choosing to do if somebody is not choosing, if somebody's actions are all causally predetermined by external stimuli and their genes and their upbringing, all of these things that have shaped their physical bodies, and that's all it is, and they're just like a series of dominoes falling, then they're not actually choosing to do anything they're doing, and therefore how can you blame them for doing anything wrong? Even the worst serial killer is really just a piece of shrapnel flying off of an explosion that just happened to fly off on an unfortunately lethal trajectory. But there's nothing about that person who chose to do it. So let's just be clear. The philosophical stakes when it comes to the free will issue, and this is why it's often ranked among some of the highest, the issues of highest importance in philosophy, is because let's just be clear that when it comes to an issue like the free will issue, the philosophical stakes are very high. And if you're and remember, and this issue connects to the consciousness issue we were just talking about. Because again, if you're going to say the mind is nothing but the physical brain, then you kind of have to admit there's no such thing as free will, because our actions are all causally determined by the way the external world sets off chemical reactions in our brain. And then if we have no free will, you have to admit now all kinds of things like morality doesn't exist and whatnot. Right? There are serious consequences to some of these beliefs, and that's why it's worth taking them very seriously. And I guess why I often like to push back on modern stereotypes and assumptions about, oh, philosophy, what are you going to do with that degree, and just study science? I mean, do you see how important some of these issues are? Anyway, I didn't mean to go on as much of a tangent there. Let's continue.
Many believe in libertarian free will, the idea that human beings
Yeah.
can make genuine choices unconstrained by past events.
That's probably the most common natural intuition that most people have, is like, yes, I have free will. Every rational agent does. Libertarian free will is about the way to put it. And the distinction would be, rather than with that deterministic view where the kind of the causes of all your actions are ultimately originating from sources outside of yourself, it would be to say, the libertarian free will advocate would say, I am the prime mover or the first cause of my own actions. The causal sequences I set into motion, they originate from me and nowhere else, right? So this has to do with where the first cause behind your actions is coming from. Is it coming from something outside of yourself? Sensory input that's just setting off chemical reactions in your brain? Or is it coming from within yourself, from within a freedom of your will?
This view underpins our sense of moral responsibility. Punishment and reward only make sense if people have the capacity
Exactly.
to choose between right and wrong.
Exactly what I was just
Religious
saying.
traditions often affirm this belief,
Yeah.
seeing free will as essential to divine justice.
Yep.
Determinists argue that
It's a common Jewish and Christian belief also that imago Dei, to say in the Bible when it says man is made in the image and likeness of God, it's a common belief to say that that means with free will the way God has. To say the Thomistic view is to say it's man has rationality and reason like God, that's a divine quality that man uniquely shares, but also as an extension of that freedom of will, which is a divine quality as well.
everything, including human decisions, is the result of prior causes, our biology, upbringing, and the laws of physics. According to some findings in neuroscience, brain activity linked to decision-making occurs before we consciously decide, suggesting our choices are predetermined.
That's not totally accurate. I believe he's referencing experiments by, I believe his name's Penrose. But interestingly, that guy himself believed in free will, and he felt his experiments proved it. His experiments tend to be commonly misrepresented, where yes, he found when doing brain scans that if he would tell subjects to make a decision to press a button or not, um, he could observe brain activity associated with pressing the button start to fire off several seconds before the person not only pressed the button, but even reported, I've made the decision to press the button, right? And so this is what a lot of people often cite out of context and say, oh, look, neuroscience disproves free will. A lot of them don't know his whole research, where what he found is that those neurons associated with pressing the button would fire off even at times when the person would choose not to press the button. And they would actually subjectively report, yeah, I felt tempted to press the button. I almost did. I sort of started to lift my hand and was about to, but at the last minute I chose not to. Right. And so this led to, I'm probably, what is it? I just want to get his name right. Penfield. I said Penrose. It's not Penrose. Wilder Penfield. He's the one that gets misrepresented here because Wilder Penfield himself believed in free will and felt his experiments proved it. In fact, he thought it affirmed a sort of very classic Judeo-Christian view of free will, where people have these temptations, right? Where he believed you do have various inclinations and temptations and habits and just natural urges to act a certain way that aren't in your control, that are just kind of determined by the environment and your nervous system, but that where your free will comes in is in the form of this sort of executive veto. It's in the form of your ability to either choose to assent to and just go along with your natural urge, or to choose to abstain from it. And just like people who had neurons associated with pressing the button, ultimately, there were some of them who said, well, I wanted to press the button, I felt tempted to, maybe I started to move my hand, but I ultimately chose not to, right? And that didn't seem to be observable in their neurochemistry, right? Whether they chose to refrain from acting on an urge. So a lot of times that neuroscientific research this narrator is mentioning is often misrepresented. And I'll say again, just to really prove my point, that same guy responsible for that research that often gets cited a lot as disproving free will, Wilder Penfield, he himself ultimately came to be adamantly convinced of the existence of free will due to his own experiments. So what does that tell you?
Rather than freely made. If your brain activity precedes your awareness of a choice that has already been made, then do you have free will? Some, like David Hume and Daniel Dennett, propose compatibilism,
Yes.
the idea that free will and determinism can coexist. They
I'm glad he brought this up. I'm just going to explain this real quick.
argue that as long as we act in accordance with our own desires, without coercion, we are free in a meaningful sense, even if those desires are shaped by forces beyond our control.
Oh God, another ad. Oh my goodness. Maybe if my channel blows up a little more? Do you think, guys, my videos will start, I'll monetize, and you think I'll get to a point where I can start loading up my videos with all these ads? This guy's probably making good money. I don't know. I'm not quite at that point yet. Um, but so compatibilism, just to explain it a little more, compatibilism, so there's this, it's sort of like there are these two axes in the free will debate. There's the actual, like, whether determinism is true or not, right? This is the determinism versus libertarianism view, right? So it's, basically, let's call it, is determinism true? Is in this, in the phrase we used earlier, libertarian free will. That would be the person who says, no, determinism's not true. I am the first cause of my own actions, right? And the determinist says, yes, free will is true. I'm sorry, not free will. Yes, determinism is true. And therefore, my actions are all causally determined, by outside causes. However, it's not just as simple as that binary debate, because there's sort of this other axis of compatibilism versus incompatibilism. And as this guy just explained, compatibilism is the view that free will is compatible with a deterministic view. And incompatibilism is the view that free will is not compatible with it, right? So somebody who believes in libertarian free will would basically say, I'm an incompatibilist. I don't believe free will is compatible with determinism. But guess what? I think determinism's false. So I'm a libertarian free will advocate. And there are some determinists like Sam Harris who will say determinism's true, but they will kind of weirdly agree with the libertarian on the incompatibilism and say, because determinism's true, free will's false. That's Sam Harris's view, that there's just no such thing as free will precisely because determinism's true. However, there is an important third group that arises from all of this, which will be people who say determinism's true, but I think free will is still true too, because I think free will is compatible with determinism, right? It's sort of like a third option here. And he mentioned some famous examples, like Daniel Dennett is probably the most famous example, at least from a scholarly perspective. Um, and so it's a more sophisticated debate than just simply is it libertarian free will or determinism? I mean, there's a whole compatibilism versus incompatibilism axis as well. But let's continue. Looks like now we're moving on to why did subtitles come on? Now we're moving on to
What is the nature of reality?
what is the nature of reality? Great heavy philosophical question to jump right into.
Do we experience the world as it truly is, or is our perception merely a filtered illusion?
This is a big one in modern philosophy, especially following Kant's famous phenomenal noumenal divide. I talked about this in my last stream a bit with the history of philosophy wrap, but one of Immanuel Kant's biggest sort of contributions to modern thought is he evoked this fundamental distinction between what he called phenomena and noumena. Now, noumena are the things in of themselves. They're objects as they exist independent of any human experience, rational experience of it, right? So like my water bottle here, if there were just no one around observing it, as it just simply is on its own. Phenomena are objects as we rationally experience them, right? Objects as we know them and experience them. And importantly, Kant brings in this more active model of perception. So it's to say perception isn't just purely passive anymore, but it's to say there are these rational categories like space and time, cause and effect, substance and property that we bring to the table and kind of map onto things as we perceive them. And really, really importantly, when it comes to the noumena, the things in of themselves, Kant casts that entirely into the realm of skepticism. He says we can't actually know anything about things in of themselves as they are objectively and independent of experience. We can only know about phenomena. We can only know about things as we experience them phenomenally. I can only know about my water bottle as I map spatial measurements and temporal measurements and cause and effect relations and substance and property relations onto it. I can only know my water bottle as I experience it, not the water bottle itself. And that's a really important, massive, influential divide that occurs in modern philosophy after the influence of Kant. And it starts to produce and make worse issues like this. Can we actually know reality itself, or can we only really know our experiences of reality? And if so, like, are those experiences of reality therefore just something else entirely from the reality itself? That's sort of the issue being gotten at here. It's really important, especially modern philosophy. I'm teaching an intro to modern philosophy class in like a week. I start teaching it, and I set aside a good couple weeks to go over like human Kant to discuss some of this very stuff because it's very important, and that's kind of the first place my mind goes when this subject is raised here.
Materialism, the dominant scientific view, holds that reality consists solely of physical matter governed by natural laws. Everything, space,
That's influence of Bacon's model, which removes final causality, and removes, really, it turns form into this almost more Platonist sense of formal cause as just these laws of nature as separate things. And then, yeah, this is where you get your classic, more modern kind of quote unquote scientific materialism view, where where Aristotle's four causes, you kind of rip formal and final causes out of it entirely, or you rip final causes out of it entirely. You kind of separate formal cause and just turn it into like laws of nature or laws of physics, and then you're only ever just dealing with material and efficient causes, or just hunks of raw material and motion, right? Like just matter and motion. Um, that's kind of Baconian influence. There's a lot that goes into that, but that gets into modern scientism. Maybe another a good video idea for future.
time, consciousness, emerges from interactions of particles and forces. But quantum mechanics challenges this assumption. Experiments suggest that observation affects reality,
That's true.
and particles exist in multiple states until measured.
That's exactly true.
Philosophers
Really, really interesting subject, by the way, which really seems to, I would say actually kind of seriously undermine materialistic worldviews. Just for a little background on the science, obviously I'm a philosopher, not a physicist, but I just find this subject interesting. Essentially, on a quantum level, um, quantum particles enter into a state of what's called superposition, where the quantum particles actually exist in multiple positions at the same time, so long as they're not being observed or measured. And it's only when then you, as the observer, go and measure the quantum particle that it's your conscious observance itself that causes the superposition to collapse into a fixed position. It's really interesting, and arguably even, I don't know, you could argue, some people point to that as an argument for free will, to show how your conscious experience itself seems to have this fundamental ability to causally impact reality. Very fascinating stuff. Again, I'm a philosopher, not a physicist, but there's a lot of intersection between these things. I just love reading and talking about it.
have long questioned the reliability of our senses. Plato's allegory of the cave argued that we perceive
Famous.
only shadows of a deeper truth.
Famous
Kant
cave
suggested
allegory.
that reality as it exists.
Plato's cave, and now he's about to talk about Kant, but just Plato's cave asks us to consider if there were a group of men who had spent their entire lives chained to a cave wall, and all they could ever see their entire lives were the cave wall in front of them. And unbeknownst to them, behind them, on a higher plane behind them, there were a group of other men. There was a big fire, and a group of other men who held up little figurines and stuff in front of the fire to cast shadows on the wall. And if seeing those shadows on the wall was the only things that the men who spent their lives chained to the cave wall had ever seen, then they would naturally come to assume that those shadows were the things themselves. So if the people in front of the fire held a little figurine of a horse up in front of the fire and it cast a shadow of a horse-like figure on the wall, it would be like, to those men who've only ever lived in the cave, the word horse, that shadow of the horse-like shape, was all the word horse meant. That was what a horse was, because they would have no knowledge of what that shadow and shape was really a reflection of, right? And then philosophical enlightenment is when somebody frees you from that cave and brings you out into the world to look upon the world for what it really is. It's one of the most single famous, probably allegories and pieces of literature and all of Western philosophy. It's really fascinating. And then yes, now he's connecting to Immanuel Kant. This is something exactly what I was talking about earlier.
Is unknowable, filtered through the limitations of human perception. Idealists like Berkeley went further.
Yeah, filtered through the limitations of human perception. I don't know if I agree with the way he phrased it, but that's what I was talking about earlier, where it's more perception is no longer this purely passive and receptive kind of function where you're just receiving the object, right? If we go back to Aristotle, perception would be like your sensitive soul takes on the form of the thing seen without its material and literally becomes the thing seen. And that's kind of if you think about it, that's sort of metaphysically connecting you to the thing itself, really. But under Kant's model of perception, we have a much more active role of the perceiver, where there's the thing, but then there's all these what to Kant are really just mental and rational categories of space and time, cause and effect, substance, property that we're mapping onto the thing in order to actually have an intelligible experience of it. So I say I don't know, the way he just phrased it, like just filter through the limits of human perception. I don't know, I find that a little reductive, but let's continue.
Claiming that reality is purely mental, existing only as experience.
That's true.
Some interpretations of simulation theory suggest
Berkeley was a radical empiricist, by the way, in that British empiricist tradition.
that our universe could be an artificial construct.
Websites your competitors don't want you to know.
Stupid ads.
Find out exactly how much your competitors are making.
Whether,
by the way, Is Reality a Simulation was originally supposed to be my video that I ended up turning into the philosophy of the Matrix, or the truth about the Matrix. But it touches on a lot of this stuff. Plato's cave allegory. It touches on these questions of is reality a simulation. So I'd highly recommend that video too for anybody who's interested.
reality is material, mental, or something beyond our understanding, the question remains: do we shape reality, or does reality shape us? What is the meaning?
Or both. Or both. It doesn't have to be radically one or the other. Arguably, Kant's view would be sort of a both view.
Of life. Few.
What's the meaning of life? I love this video. I love how this video just takes these huge philosophical questions. Like, let's just do like a little couple minute, just all the big philosophical questions in the world explained in 13 minutes. You gotta love there's a certain almost like bravado or like a gumption that goes into kind of just knocking out these heavy subjects like this in such a quick and accessible way. I'm really enjoying this video.
Questions have captivated humanity more than the search for meaning.
Oops.
Is there a grand purpose, or is existence simply an accident? Religious traditions often provide purpose through divine will. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism suggest life is a test, with moral choices determining an afterlife. Hinduism and Buddhism.
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, what arguably would distinguish Christianity is the fact that you're saved by grace rather than by works. What that means is it's not like in Islam or Judaism, it's more about here are these rules, and if you sort of through your merit, but if you do good works through merit, you can kind of earn your way into heaven. But what's supposed to kind of be the distinguishing big thing about Christianity is the acceptance that human beings are naturally sinful and therefore always going to fall short of living up to these rules. And therefore, it's not really about living up to rules. It's instead about being saved through faith and grace and having a relationship with Jesus Christ. And then Jesus Christ is the one who endures the punishment for you. And then that's what saves you. Maybe not everybody here is religious. That's fine. You don't have to be religious. Like I'm not even super religious myself, but the point is, I would argue Christianity. It's a little reductive to put Christianity in that category theologically, but anyway, this broader issue though is an important one, and it gets arguably into a bit of, I mean, I actually presented a paper at a conference over this, modernity and the metaphysics of meaning. And it's the idea that I would say prior to modernity, most people didn't really question that life had meaning. But I don't think it was necessarily due to religion, though. I think it had more to do with the fact that classically there was just more of an understood teleological basis to reality, an understanding that things had had ends that they moved towards. We talked about teleology earlier in this video when we were talking about, does God exist? And that includes, therefore, the human person has a sort of a telos, a purpose, a function, and that there's an endedness that people move towards, and the value of things can be assessed relative to this objective endpoint, and we can derive meaning from uh, moving towards that endpoint in a valuable way, and in a meaningful way. But it's the loss of teleology in modernity, the loss of final causality in teleology. I think that's a big part of what's contributed to an increasing crisis of meaning in the modern world. That would just be a little bit of my 2 cents. I'm rehashing a little bit of paper I presented at a conference back in April. But, let's continue.
Buddhism see life as part of a cycle, with enlightenment as the ultimate goal. These perspectives offer meaning through faith, but are they inherent truths or human constructs?
Yeah, well, I would just push back a little. I don't think the meaning is just coming from I'm following the rules of my religion and trying to achieve some salvation in the end. I don't really I think it's more that that theistic and generally speaking religious worldviews tend to be a lot more metaphysically rich and grounded, and as a consequence of that tend to have a much firmer teleological framework in place and a more clear understanding that everything moves towards an end. Everything has a nature moving towards an end, and that includes the human person. And perhaps for the human person, there's something very uniquely dignified about the end as a rational animal. But again, I think he's been a bit reductive with the way he's talking about religion and meaning. But let's continue.
Existentialists like Sartre and Camus reject
Yep.
preordained purpose, arguing that
We're gonna
meaning must be created by the individual. Nihilists
the famous Sartre's famous saying on this is existence precedes essence. This is actually arguably even the origin of the whole of a term like existentialism. Existence precedes essence. And so what that means is the fact that I or you or anyone exists comes before any notion of what I am or who I am or what you are or who you are. To say that we're a what or a who with a thisness is to say that we have a nature and an end we're moving towards. This is connecting right back to this issue of teleology. But the existentialist would reject that and say, we have no predetermined end. We have no predetermined even definition of what or who we are. We're not in anything other than the fact that we are. The fact that we exist comes first, and then therefore it becomes up to us to determine what and who we are after. Right? So that's the real central tenet of existentialism, that existence precedes essence. The fact that here I am with a certain Heideggerian thrownness about it, right? I'm just thrown here into existence, like some emo kid, like the ones right here, the South Park goth kids. I didn't ask to be born, right? Nobody did. We're just here. We're thrown into existence, and now we have this radical responsibility to define our existence rather than, remember, the older, the classical way, the other way around, something that has a more teleological framework in place would be what I am as a human being comes first, and that determines my nature and my end and my purpose before even I am. But the existentialist says, no, the fact that I am comes first, and then I determine everything that comes after. Very important distinction. And then how that translates to meaning then can be interesting depending on the existentialist. Probably my favorite existentialist thinker, Nietzsche, who I have a video on, I highly recommend. The Truth About Nietzsche. I think it's my most viewed video at this point. It's like 7,000 views last I checked. Highly recommend it. But Nietzsche would be all about self-creating value, right? Nietzsche's about the Ubermensch or the Overman is really an artist and a creator more than anything else. And so it's to say, so Nietzsche would actually disagree with some nihilistic claim like life has no meaning. Nietzsche would uphold that life is in fact rich with meaning. It's just a self-created meaning, right? It's having the strength of will to define new value and new meaning for yourself. That's one way of going that existentialist route. Another is, this was another thinker you just mentioned, like Albert Camus, who instead says, life is necessarily meaningless. In fact, it's absurd. And he would call it philosophical suicide to attempt to construct meaning or invent meaning where there isn't any. And therefore, the only real purpose of life is to kind of make peace with the fact that it's meaningless and to embrace the absurd and embrace the meaninglessness of it all, which is his sort of tragic hero of Sisyphus. It's is the Sisyphus who rolls the boulder up the hill for all of eternity meaninglessly, but does it with a smile on his face, embracing and reveling in the meaningless absurdity of it. So there's different ways. So there's various different schools of existentialism and different ways of going about the what comes next. But what binds them all together is this shared tenet of existence precedes essence. Anyway, just really wanted to clarify that and how that modern existentialism really radically breaks from much older philosophical traditions that are more grounded in things like teleology. But let us continue as we are now within the last 2.5 minutes or so of this video.
Take a darker view, claiming life is inherently meaningless, while humanists propose that meaning arises through relationships, creativity, and the pursuit of knowledge. Science.
Well, that would be self-creative. So that would be, hold up, what he just said. This would all be more of a self-creative value. This would be more of a Nietzscheanism, right? Creativity, knowledge, or even relationship. This would be saying, well, if existence precedes essence, and I'm now thrown here with the responsibility of what I am and no preconceived notion of who I am, this would be going a kind of a more Nietzschean route of saying, so I'm going to exert the strength of will to create value and meaning for myself, right? Because otherwise this doesn't actually make sense to say creativity, knowledge, relationships. That doesn't really make sense unless you're going to presuppose some kind of a Nietzscheanism and some kind of a notion that like I'm the Ubermensch who, I'm going to make these things meaningful. I'm going to define them as valuable and meaningful myself through my will. So, I don't know. I think this guy's maybe mixing a few things up here, but let's continue.
Through relationships, creativity, and the pursuit of knowledge. Science, rooted in evolution, suggests that life has no intrinsic purpose beyond survival and reproduction.
Well, why would survival and reproduction be a purpose? Even if you assume that kind of just evolutionary, just hyper materialistic worldview, and we're just matter in motion, and all of what we are has just been shaped by laws of natural selection. I think that's begging the question to say, well, life has no real inherent meaning, purpose, other than survival and reproduction. Why? Because survival and reproduction is what propagates your genes? Why is there any meaning to propagating your genes? Why does that matter? Why is there any meaning to surviving? Why is there any meaning to even being alive at all, let alone reproducing? None of those, if you're just going to take the view that there is just no sense of meaning whatsoever in life, then there's no meaning. You don't get to just say, well, but survival and reproduction is a purpose of life, because why? Because that's how, because evolution and natural selection tend to, select for and favor the organisms that survive and reproduce the most effectively. Well, so what? Why is there any meaning or purpose to surviving and reproducing effectively? It's just begging the question. It's just begging the question. I get a little irritated with people who try to appeal to these kind of scientific, materialistic accounts of things and act like it's in any way meaningfully answering philosophical questions, because it's not.
Yet, the study of consciousness, the universe, and the nature of reality leaves room for deeper inquiry. Is meaning subjective, or is there a hidden order to existence? Ultimately, the answer may be whatever we choose to
Is meaning subjective? Again, that'd be a kind of a Nietzscheanism
make of
there.
it. Is there life after death? Few questions have haunted humanity.
All right, we're on to our last little life's biggest philosophical questions. Is there life after death?
As deeply as what happens after we die. Every culture, religion, and philosophy has grappled with the mystery, yet no definitive answer exists. Does consciousness continue in some form, or is death simply...
Well, I mean, what do you mean by definitive answer? I mean, do you just mean something that that you find sufficiently convincing? I mean, because there are plenty of people out there who would say they do have a sufficient answer for what happens after we die, and they do feel quite convinced of it.
The end. Many religious traditions claim that an afterlife awaits. In Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, souls are believed to persist in heaven, hell, or other spiritual realms.
No, 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 no. In Christianity, you exist in the beatific vision after death, where you exist in the presence of God, but the idea is it's ultimately everything's moving towards a final resurrection in the end, and this comes from Judaism as well. It's about being resurrected in body, right? And so it's not just about stereotypes people have of being some disembodied soul existing in heaven for all eternity. That's not the Christian view. It would be about, it's about the beatific vision. Beatific vision means existing in the immediate presence of God, which prior to the end times and prior to the final resurrection, yes, means there is a sort of temporary state of existence that's not embodied. We're, I guess, kind of in heaven, so to speak, or in some non-physical state of existing in the presence of God, but that's just temporary until you're eventually resurrected in body in a more perfect form and then remain in the presence of God embodied. And that comes from Judaism, who believes the same thing. I'm not as knowledgeable about Islam's view, but yeah, that's there's some pop cultural stereotypes about the afterlife that are, it's actually somewhat theologically erroneous the way that this guy's phrasing it.
Hinduism and Buddhism teach reincarnation, where the soul is reborn in a cycle of karmic justice until reaching enlightenment. These
So reincarnation is another interesting one, and actually, it's not just in the East, but in the West, we actually have a tradition of that goes back to Plato and even before Plato and pre-Socratics. Plato believed in what he called the transmigration of the soul, and that was basically an endless cycle of reincarnation. And he had really interesting arguments for this, like the argument from opposites, this idea that opposites give rise to each other and in order to balance each other out. And so that basically, from that means from life there has to come death, and from death there therefore has to come life again. And your soul was eternal, like an unchanging like form, whereas your body was finite and particular and constantly changing like matter, and therefore your soul was constantly cycling through new bodies. This Plato got from the Pythagoreans, who were a pre-Socratic, influential pre-Socratic school, who were also influential on Plato. And the Pythagoreans, it's said, I believe even in Phaedo, even apparently borrowed it from Egyptian philosophy. But there's actually a very long tradition of that. There's a very long tradition of reincarnation in the West as well. It just obviously got kind of overcome by Christianity because it's not a very Christian view. But yeah, just a fun fact.
beliefs offer comfort and guidelines on how to obtain the best outcome. But are they more than wishful thinking? From a scientific standpoint, the dominant view is materialism.
Yep, as
The idea
always.
that consciousness is a product of the brain.
Have you noticed, if anybody's been here, and by the way, thank you for the multitude of live viewers I've been noticing coming in. But for anybody who's been here long enough, I'm curious, have you noticed us keep coming back? Have you noticed this reoccurring theme here? Have you noticed so many of these philosophical questions, we keep coming back to this similar, what he keeps calling dominant philosophical assumption in the West, especially in the English-speaking world, of materialism? When we were talking about consciousness, when we were talking about the nature of reality, when we were talking about free will, when we're talking about the afterlife, and all of it, have you noticed it all just keeps coming back to this? This is by far and away the number one most widespread, I think, assumption. It's especially dominant in the English-speaking world because the analytic tradition, the Anglo-analytic tradition, which is the dominant philosophical tradition in the English-speaking world specifically, like the UK and US, to this day has deep-seated issues with materialism, has a long history of it. And you don't see it anywhere near as much, even in the continental traditions. Even in like the German and French-speaking worlds, you don't get this heavy of a commitment to this kind of materialistic thinking. Although you could say through the English-speaking world, the West in general has become rather dominated by this kind of thinking. But it's by far and away one of the most dominant just sort of assumptions that a lot of people make to this day. And it's weird. It's radically new. Most people didn't used to think like this, but it's just this a common assumption that, well, the mind is just a physical brain, right? Or, existence is just physical stuff. It's physical extension, a kind of Cartesian definition of matter and substance really is just matter plus extension. But this is by far and away the most dominant philosophical assumption we deal with today. And yet it's interesting because notice how in so many different points of this video, every time we talk about it, we just see how there's just so many philosophical problems with that view, and how it's such a philosophically insufficient view on so many of these issues. And yet it just doesn't even begin to answer questions like when you're talking about the mind and the hard problem of consciousness. Qualia, intentionality, rationality are just like not answered by materialism at all. And yet we just keep coming back to it. It's a really interesting theme, there, and a kind of lesson to learn. But let's, yeah, we're kind of last minute of the video. I'm interested to round this out.
And when the brain dies, so does the mind. Near-death experiences challenge this notion. People who have clinically died and been revived
That's true.
often report floating above their bodies,
Well, not
seeing
just that.
bright lights, or encountering deceased loved ones. Some claim to have recalled events they couldn't have physically witnessed, leading some researchers to question whether consciousness might exist separately from the brain. One theory we've already
Yeah, actually, just pointing that I feel like this guy kind of played down the whole NDE, near-death experience thing, because if you're just going to describe it as out-of-body experiences and seeing bright lights and maybe the face of a deceased loved one or something, I think for most people that's pretty easy to write off as like, well, if you're literally like on the brink of death, of course you're going to start hallucinating. But the whole near-death experiences stuff actually gets way more fascinating than that. There are so many really well documented accounts of situations where like a blind person. There's one story about a blind person who was born blind, which is really important. That means they've never seen anything in their life. And that means if they were born blind, they don't even have the parts of the brain necessary to process visual information. If you're born blind, you don't even develop a proper occipital lobe in your brain because there's no visual information for you to process. And this person who was born blind, when they had a near-death out-of-body experience, they not only could see everything for the first time, they had perfect sight, but they floated outside and witnessed things happening on the train tracks. They saw a train go by. They made note of the number on the side of the train. And after they were revived, they're giving this big account, and all the details they witnessed are all matching up. The train number was 100% correct. All of these things. It's really creepy. And that's just one. There's like many near-death experience stories like this. So it's easier to write off if you're just going to describe it like that. Like, oh, well, some people like have out-of-body experiences and see bright lights. Well, sure, they must just be hallucinating. But if you really dig into just how detailed some of these near-death experiences are and just how fascinating some of them are, uh, many of them start to get very, very difficult to write off. And it's exactly why, yeah, like the narrator just said, there are many like credible scientists and medical doctors who have like come out and said, we may seriously we may need to take some of this stuff seriously. Because some of these near-death experiences are just impossible to account for. But let's finish up
touched
here.
on, Roger Penrose's quantum theories suggest that consciousness might be more than just a product of the brain.
Yeah.
If true, this raises the possibility that it doesn't simply vanish when we die. But without empirical proof, the question lingers. Does something await us on the other side, or is death truly the end? All right, so those were some of the biggest philosophical questions we humans face. Which one keeps you up at night? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Cheers.
All right. So that was life's biggest philosophical questions explained in 13 minutes by Easily Explained. I must say, I might have to come back to this channel to find some other more philosophically themed. We can see they do, different videos on different subjects. Some of it, fiction's darkest endings, fairy tales too dark for Disney. So obviously they do these kinds of listicle videos on a lot of different subjects, but that was I will say I rather liked that video. It was obviously simplistic in the way it was going over the philosophy, but I have to say I kind of admire somebody who's just like, let's just knock out some of these biggest, heaviest philosophical questions in 13 minutes. We're just going to talk about, why is there something rather than nothing? Does God exist? What happens after you die? What's the nature of consciousness? We're just going to knock these out in 13 minutes. There's something about that. I mean, obviously, on the one hand, there's something about that can be a little frustrating as a philosopher to witness. Um, you know, uh, just because obviously so many of these issues are so heavy and just warrant such deep conversation and discussion. But then on the other hand, I have to say there is something, I think there is a way you can kind of quote unquote do it right and kind of like obviously be simplistic and reductive in order to be concise, but do it in a way that's like still maybe kind of getting to at least the core substance of the issue, and in a way that's approachable for people, because for most people, heavy scholarship is just not approachable. And I have to say, I feel like this video actually kind of did a decent job for what it was. I rather enjoyed that video. I'm also looking forward to, uh, as I've been still experimenting with working out the kinks of content creation, and kind of doing live streams and then figuring out how to cut those up. And I mentioned at the beginning I'd previously been doing things like just taking a reaction vid and just maybe let's say I did an hour and a half live stream and just taking the 45 minutes I reacted to a video and just putting that all up as one video. But I got a couple comments like, "Oh well, that's long." So what I like about also a video like this is I feel like it's more it's a video that I can more easily do something like take each one of those individual um, philosophical questions and kind of cut them up into their own individual YouTube video. And so I think I might experiment with doing that. So you can keep an eye out for, I might try releasing those over the next few days, like kind of cutting out specific sections and highlights. Um, and I might be interested in doing stuff like that. I might come back to this channel, but I've been at it. I've been at it for, I think I'm going on 2 hours now. It is definitely quite late where I am, so I think I am going to be wrapping up. But I really appreciated everybody, even though when I first started, I think the whole first half hour or so, I was kind of just talking into the void. But I was pleased to see, as my stream went on, I noticed live viewers coming in, as well as I think at times I saw up to like half a dozen. So I was, I appreciate everybody in allowing me to kind of start to finally cobble together a small audience here. Shout out to Iratonic, again, repeat viewer. Saw you in my chat again. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate your support. Maybe I'll have to get like a sort of member exclusive thing going sometime, and we can get you in on like being a more exclusive member of my channel. Or maybe if you want to be like a moderator or something. I haven't even begun to think about stuff like that yet. Obviously, I don't have a popular enough channel or live stream or chat to even have to worry about some of that stuff. But who knows, man? I like, yeah, good night, man. I like seeing you in my chat all the time. I appreciate you, man. All right. Well, everybody have a good night, okay? And I will try to, I'm just starting my semester. First day of class is next week. Quite busy, but I'm definitely going to keep trying to churn this stuff out. Thanks for your support, everybody. Have a good night.